As business owners and founders, one of the biggest challenges we all face is building out our teams, getting the right people into the right roles. We've heard it 100 times, but for us, it's really hard because often we're doing it with our gut. We're not quite sure what the role even looks like. Then we go through this really stagnant recruitment process that's a bit archaic because we're going off CVs, bringing them in for an interview, and there's a 50% chance we're going to get it wrong. So the stats really aren't on our side. But what I want to talk to you today is to give you a little bit of data and science behind recruitment and start to think about it differently. We actually don't need to be recruiting like we were back in the 90s, just going off CVs and some simple interviews. We do have access to data, and that's what I want to talk to you today about. One of my clients said to me, before I met you, I felt like I was recruiting blind. I was going into these interviews, asking some questions, and really just hoping for the best. Sometimes people aren't even accurate and real and honest on their CVs, so it's really hard to judge. And especially as business owners and founders, we don't have that experience in recruitment. So often we delegate that out to maybe our HR teams or even the managers, but we haven't really equipped ourselves with the right skills or data to hire top talent into our teams really consistently. We hear an array of things from our clients and people like yourselves. Some of the things we hear our clients say are, they looked so good on paper, but it didn't work out. Or staff can't adapt or keep up with the business. We hire on gut feel and past experiences. We don't know what we need, so it's hard to hire. We don't have clear career paths for people. We fire people mostly due to poor fit in their roles or wrong behaviours. We don't need more ideas, we need execution-focused people. These are just some of the things we hear really consistently when we work in the community. But you're not alone. There is an array of reasons why your hires don't work out. And often it's not your fault. It's that we haven't gone through a really robust recruitment process and we haven't gathered enough data and science along the way to work out if that person really is who they say they are, and also whether they've got the learning and cognitive ability to keep up with the nature of that role that you have. In a survey to 600 executives said that only 49% of their hires last year were good hires. Now that's not great, right? That's about that 50% mark. We really need to be improving on that. Another interesting statistic is of those executives, they said 61% of people were terminated or moved out of the business because they weren't a good behavioral fit or they weren't aligned to the role from a cognitive perspective. They couldn't keep up with the requirements of the role. And again, that's staggering because some of those things we can actually predict using data and science and really increase your odds of getting the right person into the right role. And unfortunately, hiring just got a lot harder. For many of the people we work with, and probably yourselves as well, you're interviewing now over video conferencing, over Zoom, and maybe only the very last interview you have them face-to-face. But also sometimes that face-to-face interview never happens because the role might be remote. You know, you may not be hiring inside that actual office. You might be hiring them overseas. And a lot of that interviewing is done via video conferencing and phone. And we lose so much information just from those visual cues of meeting someone face-to-face, in person, what's that interaction, even some of that banter that we have during a face-to-face interview, it's quite hard and stagnant over video conferencing. So it's even more critical that we have more data up front when we're hiring, so we really understand the drives and motivators of those people, but also their cognitive requirement and their alignment to the job. Is this person really suited from a drives and needs perspective to the nature of the role that you've got in your business? Many of us get caught up in the need to have someone in a job very quickly. Often we don't get a lot of lead time in recruitment, so we have this strong sense of urgency to ring a recruiter or post a job ad. We just need someone in that job. But we haven't actually taken the time to define what we're looking for. We have not designed the job. So what I want you to think about is 3 core elements, and we call this the head, heart, and briefcase. So think of it this way, the briefcase, what are the skills, knowledge, and experience that this person's going to bring with them in their briefcase? Think of it as the things that we're looking for on the resume. So skills, they could be usually hard skills. What do those competencies look like? Then there's the knowledge. Maybe that's, whether they've come from a certain degree or they've got knowledge in a certain topic that you're really looking to bring into the business. And then experiences. What type of experiences have they had in previous roles? Maybe have they traveled? What are you looking for in those experiences for them? And you want to be looking for those in that resume. Then I want you to think about the heart piece. What are the values and the ethics of this role? Because obviously we want every role to be aligned to the business values and ethics. But again, maybe thinking from the perspective of this role as well. And how are we going to identify that in the recruitment process? And finally, the head. And this is actually the piece that most companies don't look at. They're so focused on that resume. Oh, they don't have exactly all the skills, knowledge, and experiences I was looking for. They only had 5 years experience and I wanted 8. Well, I challenge you on that. Start to think about, how is this job going to be operating on a day-to-day basis? And I want you to think about it this way. Is the job highly independent, self-driven, self-motivated, working quite independently? Or is the role quite team operating, collaborative, service-orientated? Then I want you to think about, how extroverted does the role need to be? Is this job highly focused on building relationships, developing connections? Or is it quite introspective, creative problem solving, really thinking through ideas? Or as we move into sort of the patience drive, are they needing to be calm, steady, dealing with repetitive tasks, being quite consistent about things, maybe even implementing process? Or do you want them to be operating at a really fast pace, 100 miles an hour, good at multitasking, again, thinking about where they might be? And finally, as we move into formality, is the job really rule structured, dealing with details, accuracy, precision, being very organized? And again, I challenge you to think about, what is the nature of the job? Or is the job quite flexible? There aren't a lot of rules and structure. It's quite ambiguous. There's a lot of ambiguous situations they might need to adapt to, be spontaneous with. So I'd like you to think about those 4 areas. They're the 4 factors we look at when we build out a job profile. And then I want you to start to think about the brain power required in the job. What's the learning complexity? Is this job constantly changing, evolving, and you need this person to be really, really fast in terms of how they digest information? And is it a highly complex role? Or again, sliding scale, is it more repetitive and actually they can apply the knowledge they got through their degree and experiences and just use that on the job? And there's not a lot of complexity. So that's what I mean when I think about the brain side of the job. What's that behavioral and cognitive requirement of the job? You're probably thinking, why should I care about the head side of recruitment? Why not just focus on that skills, knowledge, experience, maybe even look at what uni they went to? And I want to give you some really interesting stats when it comes to predicting whether someone will be successful in the role. So we can only predict about 1% of job performance by looking at their school leavers results. So unfortunately, that for those of you who did incredibly well at their school leavers result, whether it's your finishing exams, it's a very small predictor of whether you're going to be successful in a role. Then we move into looking at things like emotional intelligence. They start to increase your capability in the role up to about 10% predictability. But what I want to also show you is something called integrity tests. Integrity tests is something which are excellent to start incorporating into your recruitment process. Think of it like an on-the-job assessment. It could be, if you're looking for an accounts payable person, getting them to look at a balance sheet, getting them to do some quick examples. For a developer, we might have them review some code and work out where the bugs are. So it depends what role you're looking at, depends on an integrity test. They usually go for about 20, 30 minutes. Don't overcomplicate it. But again, I really encourage you to put in an integrity test in your recruitment process. They can be quite simple to set up, and they give you a wealth of information of how someone actually might cope on the job. The other thing we obviously need is interviews, and hopefully some structured interviews in your process, and you'll see that's increasing your percentage of getting a good hire. But ultimately, this is not a great overall predictor. The greatest predictor is a combination of having behavioral and cognitive data and structured interviews. This is going to give you about a 58% of accuracy of predicting how successful that person will be in the job. And often people say to me, well, that 60% mark, that's not great, right? But I'd say, well, right now, your chances of success with just doing some interviews and looking at a CV is about 30%. So I would much prefer to bet, in some cases, $100,000 is a new hire's salary and onboarding and training. There's a lot of cost in recruitment. I'd much prefer to bet on that 60% mark, and we can do a few things to go up on that percentage than on just doing an interview, because that's certainly not going to be a great predictor. And think about some of your, bad hires. What process did you put them through? And really challenge yourself to think through your own situations, where you're at, what you've done really well in the past, what's worked well. Could be things like integrity tests or reference checking, or a combination of a lot of things. It is really going to increase your chances of success. But again, it comes down to accumulating as much data as possible when you're looking at a candidate. Earlier, I spoke to you about the brain, the cognitive capability of somebody. Now, why is this important? If you think in today's day and age, we've got a lot of complexity in the work environment. Now, in some roles, they might be hyper complex, which means they're dealing with lots of different situations on a daily basis. Their role is constantly changing. And it is absolutely critical that you've got someone in those type of roles with the brain power to keep up with that role. Think about some of those hires that you've had, and I know I've certainly had them in my career, where it almost didn't matter how many times you went through something with someone, they just couldn't get it. They were asking the same type of questions and they just couldn't keep up with the complexity of the role. Now, that's a brain capacity issue, or what we call cognitive ability. So it's really important you get someone who's aligned to the role, because it's going to really predict their ability to learn, but also handle complex tasks. Have a look at these graphs, because this is a really interesting way to explain it to you. Some roles, there's complexity in the first perhaps 6 months. So there's that steep learning curve to begin with, but you'll see it straightening off. Now, this is a role where, yes, they do have to learn, but then ultimately it doesn't get overly complex long term, and it sort of stabilizes. So they might need to learn some new things, but not at an increasingly challenging pace. So if we have someone's cognitive who can ultimately keep up with that and just learn in that first 6 months, they're going to be fine. But think about a role that absolutely goes up and up and up. Constantly we're requiring this job to take on new challenges, learn new things, deal with complexity at a constant rate. We absolutely need someone who can stay and increase in their learning complexity as the role picks up in complexity. And this is really, really important, because there may have been some people in your business in the past that they learned initially, but they couldn't keep up with that steep climb that they needed consistently throughout the role. But not all roles are created equally. Some jobs don't have a lot of complexity over time. Think about those jobs that are highly repetitive. Again, you might need to learn when you start, but over time, there are really low levels of complexity. Then we move into mid-level complexity, and these might be roles, in some instances, that are management roles, do have some sort of qualification required, but there is some learning required, but it's not overly complex consistently. And then we have high complexity roles. And these are those roles that are constantly changing. Think of that peak that we looked at before. These roles are constantly changing and evolving, and the environment they're operating in is highly complex. So again, setting a job target that's aligned to the job is really critical. We don't just want really high cognitive scores off people and then put them in low complexity roles. They might get bored over time. Some of you might be thinking to yourselves, well, how do I get that cognitive score off somebody? Now, many of you will be familiar with an IQ type of test, but that type of assessment, if it's done properly, can take hours and hours and hours, and sometimes full days to do a full IQ test, and it can be quite exhaustive. And it's going to really gather a huge amount of data and be incredibly accurate. But most companies are not willing to put that type of financial investment or time investment into every candidate. So what we have is a 12-minute assessment that looks at just a few ranges of those elements, so verbal, abstract reasoning, and numerical, to really grasp in a short period of time how fast someone can get through that assessment and how accurately they can do that. Put it this way, if you go to a GP or a doctor, you might have a 10-minute visit. In that time, they'll take your blood pressure, maybe your blood sugars, They'll look at your heart, just see how you're going, and they'll do an overall quick exam. And they'll get a pretty good indication of how your overall health is at that point in time by doing some basic measurements. Or you could go and spend a day in a hospital and have MRIs and CTs and ECGs and get a full workup. Now, that obviously is going to be more accurate, but just as much as we can get a snapshot if we go to the GP and do just a small series of tests, we will get a general insight into your health. The same as with this 12-minute cognitive assessment. It's a general cognitive assessment. So it's looking at just giving you that broad insight. Here are some examples of how the results might come out. So you can see here that orange bar, that's really where we've set the job target, sort of right in the middle of the graph you can see. And we've got 3 candidates here, someone at the lower end, someone right around the job, and someone at the high end. So the question then is, who are you going to hire? And a lot of people go, oh, we're going to hire the bottom guy. That sounds like, really great cognitive, absolutely. And I'll say, well, actually, you actually need a lot more data than just this one graph. You need to know what drives and motivates them. We don't know his CV and his background. It's one piece of data. It's incredibly useful for us to have a look at, but we need to gather the rest of the data. So I'm hoping this is a good example to show you of how the results come out. And again, giving you that insight. Actually, if we hire this person at the bottom, they might get bored. But in fact, that might be a great thing for the business because we've got future opportunity, future roles that we might be able to move this person into as they learn this job. We can progress them through to other opportunities for the business. I want to explain to you the 4 quadrants that we operate in. You'll see here on the top right-hand corner, it's this innovation quadrant. People and roles that operate here are all about the vision, the future, big ideas, building relationships, absolutely future focused, and often in that growing the business through new ideas, new products, and definitely going out and meeting new people. As we move down into this results quadrant, this is really focused on taking those ideas and executing with precision and accuracy, very results orientated, absolutely going and delivering to a certain high standard. As we move around to process, this is looking at things around efficiencies in your business. It could be let's implement process, it could be software, really looking at how we can be consistent in our business. And as we move up into teamwork, these are people and roles that really operate in a teamwork, harmonious, collaborative way. It might be very customer service driven. It could be, in some instances, people that are customer facing from a service perspective. What's interesting is having a think about, well, where do you sit in this wheel? Are you up in that innovation quadrant, results? Are you process or more teamwork, or a combination? Maybe you sit on the border of some of these areas. Then you've really got to look at, well, where are my team? Where does my team sit currently? And then where do I need this role to operate? And that's really sometimes the hard thing to work out. Where does the role sit? Maybe I don't need more of me and my team because we're all quite similar. We might be all up here in innovation agility because we're out, we've founded the business, we're creating new ideas, but now we need to get down into execution or maybe even process. So again, when you're thinking about the type of role, really challenge yourself. Am I going out and finding more people like me? Or am I trying to find something that is actually going to help the team deliver on our strategy? In the tool, we use 17 different type of profile types. Once you start to think about, well, where might this role fit in terms of which quadrants based on where you think the role might be focusing on, I want you to now think about, well, which reference profiles might I be looking for in the role? So up in our innovation and agility quadrant, we have the persuader patterns, the mavericks, the captains, and the venturers. And these are roles that are really focused on thinking about the future, where are we heading, building relationships, very proactive in style, and often quite high verbalizers, really communicating out loud, talking through ideas, operating quite quickly, and usually quite high levels of dominance, so they're very goal-orientated. As we move down into our results and discipline quadrant, we start to look for the strategist style profile. We even have the analyzers, the controllers, or the scholars might operate in this quadrant. These profile types are really focused on not only being very goal-orientated and proactive, but they're starting now to think more about rules, structure, some discipline around how they operate, really focusing more on that precision and accuracy, and potentially a little bit more introspective and reserved. They're not going to be those high verbalizers like our mavericks and persuaders. They might be more reflective. Let me think it through. Let me, again, strategize and work out what we need to do and go out and make it happen. As we move over into process and precision, you start to see roles that are the operators, the guardians, the craftsmen. And these roles, you can see they're a little bit more stable. They're calm, they're rule orientated. So again, accuracy and precision, but quite introspective. So really thinking through ideas creatively, more quiet and reserved. And the interesting thing here is they're a little bit more team orientated. So they're not as dominant as they were over on the other side of the wheel. They're thinking about everybody else. How can I help you? Those service style mentality. As we move up into teamwork, we sometimes call this quadrant customer experience or employee experience. They're thinking about everybody else. So they've got a high service drive. They're not as dominant. They're more team orientated, collaborative, harmonious. And also we see them being more extroverted. They're more outgoing. They like verbalizing, and they'll have low drive for a huge amount of rules and structure. So great again in service because they're flexible and adaptable. Now, we always have some profiles that don't sit really cleanly in any of these areas. They're more our adapters, our individualists. And actually, some of these profiles don't sit smack bang in those quadrants. They might sit on the border. What we wanted to offer you today is to go and have a look at these 17 reference profiles. If you're thinking about recruitment, you're probably thinking, oh, I think I know which quadrant they might be operating in, but I'm not quite sure what style of profile I'm looking for. Go and download our guide. There's a link below where you can go and visit our website and download this 17 reference profile guide for free. And you can flick through that and start to think about, well, what am I looking for in this job? And who would make a really great fit in that role? So in summary, as we go to assess our candidates, we can start to think about their resume, their skills, their knowledge, their experience. We do want to focus on that briefcase. It is important. And then we move up to the heart, the values and the ethics, and these things can really be brought out in interviews through some powerful interview questions. And last but not least, we've got to assess the brain. What are their behavioral drivers? What drives and motivates them at work? And are they a good fit for that role? And also that cognitive ability that we were talking about earlier. Do they have the brain power that's aligned to the nature of the job? So these are all the things I want you to be thinking about, that head, heart, briefcase. That framework's really powerful as you start to think about the role and the way you're designing it, but also as you start assessing the candidate. Have we ticked off that we've looked at all of those interesting elements? My big reminder to all of you is stop recruiting like you're back in the 90s. We do have data available for you to be recruiting more effectively and using a lot more science around recruitment. We don't have to just be looking at the CV and doing interviews. We can increase our chances of success through using data, through accurate, insightful data that's going to predict workplace behaviors, predict performance, predict the speed they learn. So I would strongly encourage you to think about how you can be recruiting differently this year. We need to evolve. We need to change as we move into the future of work. And that means really looking at how you hire top talent into your business. I hope you've enjoyed.